knew what it was. That's why I didn't ask you.
Well, this morning we are so fortunate and blessed that Tricia is going to be presenting something to us from an article and her additional thinking about Paul as a traveler in the 81st century, because you didn't call the travel agent, you didn't go on Yelp or on Experian or whatever it is, and or travel.com or something, and you didn't have your choice of
A king or a queen.
right, non-smoking, right?
Non-bed bugs or.
Right, yeah. Yeah. A whole different world.
No Airbnb.
So Tricia, take it away.
All right, okay, ran off some copies of the map of his journeys. I didn't make enough for everybody here, but if people want to have a map, go ahead and take one, pass it on, and you might want to make some more copies or not.
Yeah, do you want me to go make a couple more?
Yeah, coffee.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's such a nice. It is a nice.
I'll be right back. Let me, can I go make a copy real quick?
Sure one.
You keep going.
Colored.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, please.
Yes,
There will be
please.
enough. I'm not bossy, am I? Thank you. Didn't really have to. It looks like we have enough.
Okay,
But you,
yeah, I have one. And I've seen it enough.
No, but you're like, all right.
I'll wait for her to come back.
I was at the beginning of one of the Christian talk shows that was Chip Ingram actually. And he was talking about kids and their role back in this time.
Mhm.
And I won't remember all 3 or 4 points he was trying to make, but it was like they would lay the baby at the father's feet. And if the father picked him up, okay. If the father picked the baby up, then he lived or she lived. So if it wasn't the right sex, or if it had a deformity or whatever, and they, if the father didn't pick the baby up, or the father got up and left, they would go drown the baby.
Oh, no.
It was like really,
So, yeah, that was
Oh.
a strange sermon, huh?
we asked how it started off, but I mean, he was talking about the role of children
Mm.
and it's kind of the role of the parents in it and the responsibility. So anyway, I didn't mean to get us off track, but just talking about the stark differences.
Right, yeah, it was a much more brutal time, and human life was cheap.
Yeah, and they were sold,
Is-
so the parents
yeah.
would sell them into slavery too.
Yeah, that too, when they didn't have, yeah. Okay. Shoot. So anyway, I'm talking about St. Paul's traveling and travel conditions in the 1st century. And anyway, so over the course of Paul's journeys, he traveled about 9,150 miles. Yeah, it was over many years, but his first journey from Syria to Cyprus and on to Pisidia lasted about a year. And his second one across Asia Minor and into Europe took about 3 years. And his final journey, that he took for spreading the word, took him back to many of the cities that he visited in the second journey, and it lasted about 5 to 6 years, and it included a 3-year stay in Ephesus, so he wasn't traveling all the time. He faced many difficulties and dangers traveling, and whether it was from the elements, robbers, wild animals, shipwrecks, or an angry mob, as we all know about the angry mob. So I'll discuss some of these later. And in 2 Corinthians, chapter 11, verses 25 through 27, Paul does write about his adventures. He says, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I've been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Makes you wonder why he continued. But he was really determined to spread the word. So, we can really appreciate how determined he was when we realize all the dangers he faced. And I enjoyed the article because of the historical context him and his journeys were put into,
And would you say the scripture again, 2 Corinthians?
Chapter 11, 25, 27,
Thank you.
25 to 27. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the author of the article references various Greek and Latin writers to present a fairly detailed picture of travel in Paul's time. The first one he talks about a lot is The Golden Ass by Apuleius, and he was born around 123 AD. And it describes a man who was turned into a donkey in the area of Corinth and Thessalonica, and Paul traveled through that region. So the novel is helpful. And how well you traveled in the first century depended on how much you could afford to spend, which is same as today, yeah. But based on Paul's letters, it seems that Paul didn't have much, if any, money. He relied on what he could earn on the road and donations from the church. And he couldn't expect hospitality on the road from people that lived near the Roman roads, because the Romans requisitioned their animals and vehicles, and also they made demands on the people themselves. So they just didn't have, they couldn't spare any hospitality. So Paul had to pay for that, and he needed a source of income, which fortunately for him, he was a tent maker. And he could repair and make leather goods, which would include just about everything people needed: sandals, harnesses, and tents, of course. So, but the downside of this was that there was no telling when his skills would be needed, so he didn't know how much money he would earn. And also, the work would slow his travels down. He might be needed to repair something just as he wanted to set out, or in the middle of the day, and therefore he didn't know when he would be stopping for the night, and he didn't know where he'd be. So, and worse than that, he could be requisitioned by a Roman to do the work, and then he wouldn't get paid. So, of course,
Today.
yeah. So Paul walked due to his financial circumstances. Renting or buying a carriage was out of the question, and horses weren't practical, and they were also expensive, but they weren't used for long distance. And if you weren't used to riding them, they present a challenge, and it could be kind of painful to ride all day. So, and even a donkey to carry baggage was expensive, and it wouldn't have speeded up his journey. And of course, the Romans could have requisitioned any of these things anyway, and then you'd be back where you started, on foot. So the accepted daily distance one walk in a day was about 20 miles, but that was under optimal conditions, and it was unlikely that Paul made 20 miles most days. There were other things besides his work which could slow him down. So there's a famous diary from a pilgrim who visited the Holy Land in 333 AD, and it listed the distances between the inns and posts along the road between Constantinople and Tarsus. And Paul traveled that way in reverse. So, but about every 12 to 14 miles, there was a stopping point. And Paul probably would have tried to stop at inns or towns if he could. So 14 miles a day seems more better distance for walking on foot. It might have been less, but 14 miles sounded like a good,
It's average.
yeah, to me, it did. And there were a lot of things that could slow Paul down. He was hungry and thirsty sometimes, as he mentioned, and Paul could find himself on the open road at nightfall, not just because of his work, but because the heat or cold sapped his strength. Hailstorm could force him, the weather could force him to take cover, or, mountain passes could be blocked by an early or late snowfall, and spring floods could make roads impassable. And so who knows how far he walked. He also walked the Anatolian Plateau, which is in central Turkey, and it has rises to 3,000 feet in most places, but in many places it rises higher and sometimes even double that. So walking was hard. And it also had extremes in temperatures, and the mountains that he walked in northern Greece weren't much better than that.
And he had sandals, not hokas.
Right, exactly. No, yeah, no good hiking boots.
No.
No.
I'm thinking of the headache and migraine from the altitude.
Yeah, that too. The air is thinner, so it's harder to breathe. Yeah. And you do get, up in that high, you can get headaches. Yeah, altitude sickness. So then the inns were not, they varied. They were not great. You couldn't get a good night's sleep there. Let's put it that way. No matter whether you stayed in the courtyard, which was basically where most travelers stayed, and the rooms around it were available to rent, but Paul likely didn't rent them. So the courtyards were had the baggage and the animals there. So It was a very noisy place. And the baggage had to be watched. It always had to be watched if you stopped at an inn, if you know. So, like I said, he probably didn't rent a room, but if he did, he would have had to share it with a stranger, and you can't trust that the stranger's honest. And also there were bed bugs. So the bed bugs, yes, they were so ubiquitous that they were described in a story from the Acts of John written in the 3rd century. John and his friends were staying at an inn one night, and his friends urged him to take the only bed in the room. And as the night went on, it was clear that John was having a lot of trouble with the bed bugs. And sometime after midnight, he'd had enough, and he commanded the bed bugs to leave their home and quote, "Be quiet in one place and keep your distance from the servant of God," unquote. After that, things settled down and everybody was able to sleep. And in the morning, John's friends were amazed to see this huge pile of bugs in the corner of the room. They pointed them out to John, and then John thanked the bugs and allowed them to go back to their homes. So. Anyway, Paul was fortunate to be traveling at a time when peace reigned in the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana. But the roads still weren't completely safe. The main roads were policed well enough for people to have a sense of safety. But the emperor was the one you appealed to for safety, really. So, and the poor didn't have any access to him and couldn't claim his intervention. And for the powerful and well-to-do, it was another matter. So imperial authority was only exercised on personal demand. So, and appealing to local officials wasn't much help either. There was no regular policing force, and even if the officials took their duties seriously, they couldn't cover their territory systematically, so their hands were tied in the matter. And Apuleius makes the towns in northern Greece sound like the Wild West. Individuals had to fend for themselves. In the Golden Ass, many towns were run by corrupt families, just like in the Wild West where there were no sheriffs. And the poor were really defenseless in the face of all of this, and a poor traveler had even less recourse because neighbors could band together against robbers and thieves. But it was still easy to avoid being caught, and it was easy to move to a new town to avoid escape. And, you know, if you were a murderer, that you just moved to another town and, you know, you carry on, right? So, but if people were mad enough, they did band together, they could get together, and justice was swift, and a thief could be executed on the spot. So very Wild West lynchings in the Wild West. So, and Paul was an outsider, and he didn't have friends or family on the road that he could turn to. So he was just on his own, and the towns were bad, but the countryside was even worse. And there was an area, a populous section between Athens and Corinth that was infamous for highwaymen. And we do take for granted that the Roman roads that Paul walked were good Roman roads, right? You know, but that was not all the case. All Roman roads were not created equal. They were in the area of the empire where Paul walked, the roads were paved around the towns. But in the countryside, they were gravel. So you had the risk of a stone flying up from a carriage and hitting you. And that could be deadly if you're hitting the right spot with it.
Right.
Yeah. So wild animals were also a thing back then. In the Golden Ass, a rich man captures bears, wild boars, and wolves in the area around Berea and Thessalonica. That's good. Anyway, for the gladiatorial shows, and Paul passed through there. And the distance between Berea and Thessalonica is 45 miles. So he probably spent about 3 nights, maybe more.
Wow.
Yeah, so he's out at night with wild animals, but that could have happened anywhere in the countryside. There were wild animals that were dangerous, wild animals. They weren't just little furry bunnies. Yeah, or deer or anything. So it was customary at the time to divide your journey between land and seas, and part of Paul's second journey was by sea. He sailed from Troas to Neapolis at the port of Philippi. And his return journey from Corinth via Ephesus to Caesarea was also partially by sea. At the beginning of the 2nd century AD, Pliny the Younger wrote that the intense heat made it impossible to make his entire journey by land, but because of the north winds, he could not go all the way by sea. There was a very brief sailing season in the Mediterranean, and the prevailing Etesian wind blew from the northwest. So any voyage going southeast was generally smooth sailing. As a Roman official, Pliny could requisition carriages or ships as needed. But Paul had to settle for whatever was available that he could afford, and he probably took the first boat leaving Troas to Greece, and he didn't care which port in Greece he ended up in. We do know that this journey was late in the summer when Paul sailed from Troas, because Luke wrote that the Yom Kippur fast was over. During September and October, sea travel was risky. Between March and May, it was also risky, and between November and February, it was extremely dangerous, and it basically shut down. Paul's final journey to Rome started so late in the year that one storm he endured lasted almost 3 weeks.
Was it March to May? What was the other one? The last one?
March, April, May, and September and October, it was risky. November through February, it was too dangerous. So only,
Doesn't leave much time.
it doesn't really leave a lot of time. I mean, some people, they did sail in November and February, but it was, I guess, military and, when it had to be done, you weren't getting on a ship to even to spread the word. So the navigation at the time was done by the sun and the stars and not just the landmarks. So that was another reason that navigation in the Mediterranean was impossible in the winter, that there were gray skies all the time. It wasn't just necessarily stormy. Sailors did prefer to stick close to the land, moving from one land siding to another during the day and staying in port every night. So Paul's ship from Troas to Miletus made frequent stops, and that kind of reminds me of Greyhound bus, and probably just, I don't know, sometimes travel today is not that pleasant, but anyway. So the biggest and the best ships of the day were the cargo ships that brought Egyptian grain to Rome. And they weren't that big, right? They were only 180 feet long, and their beamer width was 50 feet, and their depth from the deck to the bottom of the hold was 44 feet, and they could hold several hundred passengers. And the journey from Rome to Alexandria took 10 to 20 days approximately. But going back to Rome was not such a great trip. They couldn't sail close to the wind, and the keels weren't deep enough, and they lacked jibs. And I don't know how many of you are sailors, but I had to look it up. So a jib is a sail in front of the vessel. And instead of going back the way they came, they had to sail northeast toward Asia Minor. And during adverse winds, they had to remain at anchor, waiting for a favorable wind and making brief dashes when they could. And so for this reason, Paul never took a westbound ship willingly. The only time he did was his journey to Rome when he was arrested and went to Rome. So travel from the Mideast to Europe was done on foot to avoid delays, and taking a ship back east saved Paul many weary weeks on foot, though, although sea travel was not great. Pliny did claim that there was a benefit to sea travel, especially if it made you seasick, as it was, according to him, the seasickness was good for ailments of the head, eyes, and chest. Yeah.
Urged you.
Tell yourself, just
Yeah.
keep telling yourself that.
Right.
Never felt that was seasick.
Anyway, the only time Paul sailed west was on his final journey to Rome to be tried by the emperor, and the centurion escorting Paul found a grain ship in Myra that was going to Rome. And in Acts 27 verses 7-8, Luke described the problems caused by the wind. Quote, "When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea," unquote. So throughout Acts 27, Luke repeatedly mentions having to sail on the sheltered side of an island or the lee side to avoid northwesterly winds and to make any progress. He also mentions that Paul repeatedly urged the captain to go no further at Cyprus and then on to Crete at Fair Havens. And his warnings, of course, were ignored. And so once the grain ship passed the Cauda on Crete, it no longer had the sheltered side of the island, and its destruction was inevitable. So there were no passenger ships in Paul's day. Cargo ships took passengers where space allowed, and the passengers had to haggle over the fare. There were no set departure times or dates. The captain had to wait for favorable wind, so passengers had to stick close and be ready to leave at a moment's notice. The owners of the ships didn't provide anything for their passengers except for water. So the passengers had to bring anything they needed, food and other supplies. They also had to cook their own food, but they had to wait until the crew was done eating. And they also had to wait their turn at the hearth fire with the other passengers. And between all the waiting, anything could happen before people were finished cooking that would make it so you couldn't finish cooking. A stray wave could douse the flames, or the rough seas could make it necessary to put out the fire, because you don't want a fire, out of control fire on a wooden vessel, right? So passengers also had to live and sleep on the deck where there wasn't much shade. So experienced passengers brought small tents, which was helpful for Paul. So he had an opportunity on board to earn money for his passage. And Paul, of course, needed companions on board ship as much as he needed them when he traveled on land, because he needed help carrying the provisions and he needed help watching them. It's always having to watch the provisions. You don't get much sleep unless there's 2 or more people with you. So traveling by sea was unpleasant, and it was made worse by fear, because the sea was a dangerous, unknown thing to most people. And shipwrecks were common. Paul had suffered through 3 of them, and he'd also been adrift on the sea for a night and a day. All sorts of mishaps could happen to a smaller craft on the open sea. It could be run over by a larger ship, or it could break a plank on a heavy piece of flotsam. So survivors of these accidents were at the mercy of the currents, because there was no way to send an SOS. And even if another ship spotted you, there was no guarantee of rescue. It was hard for ships of the day to change course. And the sad fact was that human life was cheap. So if it was too difficult or simply just inconvenient, you would be left behind. And Paul was fortunate that he only spent 24 hours adrift before either being rescued, which is extremely unlikely, or washing ashore. So when we think of all these difficulties and dangers he dealt with when traveling, we can better appreciate his determination for spreading the word and be very thankful that he was that determined. Otherwise, we wouldn't have.
Well, that was
Yeah.
interesting.
And when I was done fixing all this, I came across another, as a short article, it's the Pax Romana and maritime travel. And it still says there were some dangers, even though the sea was peaceful, because the sea is dangerous, but it's just a couple of pages if anybody is interested in.
Yeah, can you send me the link and I'll send it to everybody?
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
Thank you. And I'll send folks the link to the article that, the main article that Tricia read as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, when they say Pax Romana on the seas, I guess they're talking mostly about piracy being under
Yeah,
control.
yeah.
Yeah, that's the one thing that they did a good job of
Right.
knocking out.
Yeah.
Because they had a vested interest in that.
Right.
Yeah, cool. Questions for Tricia?
Just great job.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Teacher. Well, I'm glad I was born at this
I
time.
know.
Amen.
I
Amen.
still think, the Roman roads, it's like, they weren't so great because our roads are,
Yeah, the more things change, the more they say this.
Yeah.
I was thinking it's like things, I was kind of jotting down some of the stuff that I'm involved in.
Yeah,
That I'm like, she's like, oh, he makes leather, and I work with apprenticeships and tradesmen.
Yeah.
You gotta, learning the trade. And like, she said he walks a long time without food and water, like, that's faster cardio.
yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about, when I work in Greenville, half of what I take is my provisions, I'm like,
Right.
well, I have to think about lunch tomorrow, I have to think about supper tomorrow night, I have to, and breakfast each morning, and yeah, so it's all logistics.
It's all logistics, girl.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, cool.
To Athens.
That'd be a great trip.
Yeah.
So she was talking about, there are times that so I was wondering, had assumed he usually had partners or, travel companions.
Yeah.
But it sounded like he didn't always.
He probably always traveled.
Yeah, he always have to.
Especially you think about, he was traveling with money once.
From the
The
church.
collection
I got it.
starts.
I
So, and Acts does mention people that were sent along. And it's only reasonable that churches who had made contributions might send somebody with,
Mhm.
to keep an eye on their part of the contribution,
Right.
So, yeah. And nobody ever says this, Acts doesn't ever say this, and N.T. Wright doesn't talk about this, but probably some of those people were armed.
Yeah.
Human nature being what it is.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
they would set out on roads that, like you said, there was no police force. There was no little camera system or blue call box. You could be robbed and left for dead.
So so armed would be knives and swords. I mean, there weren't
Yeah,
guns.
right,
Right?
right. Knives and swords and, yeah.
Were
Yeah,
there cannons on the ships at that point?
No.
Probably not.
No.
Not on the Green
no,
Ship.
we don't, the West doesn't have gunpowder until the Middle Ages.
Right, that's right.
Oh, wow.
Right, because it's a Chinese invention. Right. Thank you so much for
You're
doing
welcome.
that. That was marvelous, absolutely marvelous. Well, we're again in a heavy narrative section here, in the midst of Paul's journeys. Paul before Roman authorities, Acts 23:12 through 26:32. And he's made it to Jerusalem, and then he's been evac'd to Caesarea to get away from a mob. And just by way of reminder, we are thinking about how Luke is making explicit parallels between Paul's trials under the Romans and Jesus' trials. And can you come up with some of the parallels, just a few to remind us of those?
Lies.
Lies, yeah. What lie is told about Paul?
He was trying to desecrate the temple and
Mhm.
all these kind of things.
Mhm. And what was a lie told about Jesus? Yeah, it had to do with the temple.
Oh, that he said he was gonna tear the temple
Tear
down.
down.
Exactly, right. So false accusations about the temple. Yeah. What else?
The Jewish leaders wanted both of them dead.
Yeah.
And the Romans did not
Care.
see that they didn't see, they did anything wrong, but didn't want to upset the Jews.
Exactly, yeah.
Just where they passed them back and forth.
What bad past that, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of passing back and forth, right? Nobody wants to take responsibility. Boy, doesn't that sound like bureaucracy today, right?
Mhm.
Right? But nobody wants to hack off an already volatile constituency, right? Yeah,
So they each had to go through a series of going to a higher authority.
yeah. Or just a different authority, you know? Here, we want you to
Different
take a look
authority,
at this case. Here, we want you to take a look at this case. Yeah. And yeah. Of course, yeah, go
I
ahead.
said that, so he testified about Jesus in Jerusalem and Rome, which they both.
Yes. Jerusalem is a center point for both. For Paul, what is distinct is he is going to go to Rome. And of course, that is because why does Paul get to go to Rome?
Because he's a citizen and he
Exactly.
kept putting that out or he'd been dead before.
Right,
Yeah, and you couldn't put him in jail without,
you couldn't
you
execute.
can execute him.
Yeah,
'Cause he
without,
was in jail.
Yeah, he was in jail. Yeah, you couldn't
Right.
execute him. He
Right.
definitely was in jail for 3 years. almost.
right, he could always appeal to Caesar if his life was at stake. Right.
And it's funny how they follow the rules.
Yeah, right.
While being wretched.
Right, yes.
I
Absolutely,
want to kill you, but go to trial
Absolutely.
first.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And they could not find anything. That's another parallel. They couldn't find anything wrong with either.
Right. It's that they realize in both cases, this is some sort of internal religious dispute. Why are you bringing this to us? You know?
Send them back.
Now, why does Paul say he is on trial? Somebody read for us, chapter 24, verses 20 and 21. And then we'll go to 26:6. But somebody read for us, chapter 24, verses 20 and 21.
Or let these men here state what wrongdoing they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Other than this one statement, I shouted while standing among them, today I am on trial before you concerning the resurrection of the dead.
Right. Thank you. So,
Talking about Jesus,
well,
kind of.
kind of.
Yeah.
Kind of, but remember, Pharisees believe that there is an afterlife, that there will be a final judgment, that there is a resurrection of the dead. Sadducees do not. Remember, Paul was pretty slick and he got his opponents to fight with each other. And he got some of them to kind of take his side, right? This is just over the resurrection of the dead. We all, right? You, my Pharisee brothers, we're in this together. Yeah, so it's sort of left-handedly about the specific resurrection of Jesus, but he tries to make it more generally about a Jewish doctrine. Look at 26:6. What does he say there?
I'll read. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I am on trial today.
Thank you. So I'm on trial because of the promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Again, he's very firmly rooting this as something within the Jewish faith. Pretty savvy there. And important historically, because is there such a thing as freedom of religion in that world?
Mm-mm.
No.
You're born into what you're born into.
Well, legal, there is such a thing as a legal religion, and there is such a thing as illegal religions. Judaism is recognized as a legal religion. So as long as Christianity is understood as something that exists within Judaism, it is a legal religion, and it has all kinds of governmental protections. The minute it's recognized as something separate,
It loses that. protection.
loses all that. And so think now what the church at that time, it's trying to thread a needle. Gentiles are coming in, but we still want to be considered a Jewish religion. But we don't want the Gentiles to have to become Jewish. How do you thread that needle? That's tough. Paul is insisting, I am Jewish and I am on trial because of Jewish beliefs. How does Paul throughout characterize his relationship with normative Judaism? I don't give you a passage because
It's all over, yeah.
All over.
He's-
yeah, what,
He keeps saying he is Jewish. He was given a Jewish training. He's a Pharisee. He was taught under Gamaliel.
Yeah, yeah.
And
yeah, absolutely.
he's teaching nothing but what the prophets and Moses said.
Absolutely,
And he kept
absolutely.
the law.
Yeah.
Kept the law, yes.
Yes.
Yes, a member of our strictest sect, he says at one point. Yeah. Do you remember back when Jerry Lewis used to have his telethon? Was it?
Muscular dystrophy.
Muscular dystrophy, yeah. People forget sometimes he was Jewish, and he referred to himself every now and then as the super Jew. The super Jew. I'm the super Jew. That's what Paul is saying. I'm the super Jew.
Mhm.
You think you're Jewish? I'll show you Jewish.
I'm a Jew of Jews.
Yeah, yeah. So he really puts himself forward almost as an embodiment of normative Judaism. And of course, who did embody the law, truly? Jesus. Felix, when Paul is before Felix, he gets alarmed and in hearing some of this and sends Paul away. Why do you think this happened? Somebody read for us chapter 24, verse 20. Actually, let's start at
22.
let's start at 22. You read my mind.
Where my book is separated.
And
Yes.
go through 25. Yeah.
I've got it. But Felix, who was rather well informed about the way, adjourned the hearing with the comment, when
Lysias.
thank you, Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. Then he ordered the centurion to keep him in custody, but let him have some liberty not to prevent any of his friends from taking care of his needs. Some days later, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him speak concerning faith in Jesus Christ. And as he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix came frightened and said, "Go away for the present. When I have an opportunity, I will send for you."
Yeah, why do you think he gets alarmed?
Because he knows about Jesus.
And
He
who
knows
God
about the way,
offers.
and that Paul is basically preaching to him.
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit kind of.
Yeah. Future judgment, self-control. Felix doesn't want to hear any of that.
Wife.
Yeah, right.
He
Yeah.
knows what's going on too.
Yeah. What's Felix really up to?
Wants a bride.
He wants a bribe. Yeah, and he's willing
He
to let
wants
it
a bribe.
drag out for 2 years, right? And poor Paul languishes there in prison until Festus comes along. We in the South can feel the humor in those names, Felix and Festus. Festus.
That whole bribe thing with government officials, when you travel outside the United States.
Right, right.
Don't think your passport means very much.
That's right. It's a whole different world.
Particularly when they take it away from you in Russia,
Uh-huh.
you don't get it back until they decide you can have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a weird feeling. Yeah.
And this is Paul, a Roman citizen.
Yeah.
This is how he's treated, right? Notice something about how prisons work. In verse 23, Felix gives orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but should have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. If you were in prison, it's not like you were issued your jumpsuit and here's your laundry, and then you're going to come to meals 3 times a day. No. You're just sitting there. If you're lucky, you're under house arrest, or maybe it's like Philippi and you're in a little cave. But if you're going to get provisions, people have to bring them to you. There's no budget
Commissary.
for food and water and laundry.
So no doctors with orders.
No. Nada. So if you had no support network, you could dehydrate and starve to death in prison, right? So again, Paul, here we see Paul's network, the importance of his network that is with him. Each trial finds no fault with Paul, yet he is not released. So we see in this passage, because they're looking for a bribe. Let's look over in 26, verses 30 to 32. Somebody read that for us. 26 verses 30 to 32. This is Festus.
The king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice. Who was Bernice? And those
Right.
sitting with them. They left the room, and while talking with one another, they said, "This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar."
Yeah.
That mean it could have been set free before?
Yeah.
Yeah. And at this point, when he says, "I appeal to Caesar," at that, what Agrippa is saying, if he hadn't said that right then, he said, "I was prepared to let the guy go."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could have.
But the other,
But now he's tied my hands. I have to send him to Rome.
but the other people wanted him dead.
Yeah, right,
So like,
right.
So gave him
Right.
some protection, but not really.
Right. So Paul says, "I want to go to Caesar," because he sees the crowd is turning against him.
right.
He also sees he's in a situation where an appeal to Caesar would be honored, he hopes. But Agrippa realizes, I mean, he hadn't broken any laws. I could let him go. Agrippa doesn't care that he'd get lynched and mobbed,
Right.
but he's saying from a legal standpoint, I got nothing, right? Of course, Paul always uses arrests as an opportunity to do what?
Testify.
There you go. And that's a perfect word choice, right? Because that's a legal term, to testify. And Jesus uses that term talking to his disciples about what they will do. The New Testament, the letters use that term to give your testimony. And of course, that would have resonated with Christians in situations where they were brought before a tribunal and said, will you burn the pinch of incense and say Caesar is Lord? No, I'm going to give testimony that Jesus is Lord, right? So there is a recognition here that we are talking to an audience and to most excellent Theophilus, who may be somebody who's sitting in those tribunals looking at people brought before him, for all we know, right? That Christians are going to bring a testimony that Jesus is Lord and about the resurrection of the dead. So Paul is always preaching in these circumstances. So the question is, what message is he preaching? So let's look at chapter 24, verses 24 to 27. Let's see, sorry, 14 to 17, excuse me.
I'll
What
read
does,
it.
thank you, Elizabeth.
However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have. There will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor, to present offerings.
Thank you. So notice what he does here. I do follow the way.
Mhm.
Remember, that's the name that's most pervasive. And notice, which they call a sect. They acknowledge that we are part of Judaism. I worship the God of our fathers. I'm a good Jew. Yes, I'm a little eccentric here. I do follow the way. We're a group within the group, right? But it's about the resurrection of the dead. And look at 26 verses 19 through 23. Somebody read that for us.
So then King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. Instead, I preached to those in Damascus first, and those in Jerusalem and all the region of Judea, and to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God and do works worthy of repentance. For this reason, the Jews seized me in the temple and were trying to kill me. To this very day, I have had help from God, and I stand and testify to both small and great, saying nothing other than what the prophets and Moses said would take place, that the Messiah must suffer, and that the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light to our people and to the Gentiles.
Thank you. Thank you. Pretty straightforward, right? It's fascinating that he's being called to say, well, what'd you do? Well, here's what I did.
I preached
I preached. Yeah.
death, burial, and resurrection.
And he says what he preached about, and he says why he preached. What was the proximate cause? What started him on the path of preaching?
Road to
Brought to
Damascus.
Damascus.
Yes, his heavenly vision. I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. Although Rome has legal and illegal religions, it is not hostile to the phenomenon of religion. It's certainly not, we're used to this modern and postmodern world where there's a lot of disdain and suspicion of the spiritual or the religious, particularly the Christian. That's not the case in that world. He had a vision. He had a vision.
Mhm.
Nobody's going to question that. He had a vision. People have visions. I was not disobedient to the vision. Right?
Vision.
So as we've been reading through I've asked in this next question for you to think about, I said 5 elements, that's not a magic number, that have emerged throughout Acts as essential to authentic Christian witness. So from what we've just read, what's, and before we use the examples that I list there,
Mhm.
what are some essential things about Christian witness, just from these 2 little passages we've just read?
Essential.
Yeah,
Well, God raised Jesus from the dead.
yes,
And the death could not keep a hold on him.
yes. So that's,
That part of it.
that's critical, right? That the death and resurrection, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
And God had a set purpose and foreknowledge.
Yeah, so continuity with the law and the prophets,
Yeah.
right? Right. So let's look at Acts 2:22 through 24. Oh, and the third thing, what's an essential element of Christian life that it's nowhere in the Bible? Your particular Christian witness has something that's essential and unique to you.
You share a witness of what you have seen.
Bingo,
Yeah.
bingo. Yes, yes.
Would you say that? I couldn't.
So you share a witness of what you have seen or had done.
Yeah.
Been through.
There was one more.
We're getting there. I thought you were like, what else? What else?
Then you would have to be honorable to be believed. Wouldn't you?
Well, not really, because Paul was not honorable,
Yeah.
but he was willing to go through the opposition. Because whenever people, like I was at a barbecue yesterday, and one of my family members came on there like, "Oh my God, you used to really drink a lot of sugar." And I was like, "Yeah, I used to." But all he remembers is me drinking a lot of sugar. He can't see that now I drink water, and he can't see it. But, so if I was out preaching about drinking water, he was like, "Nah, bro, you drink lemonade."
I know.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
there's also a part where you have to be able to walk through the process of people not believing that you've changed.
And we can all, ultimately, bluntly, people don't care what happened 2,000 years ago.
That's true.
And what does this mean to you? What is it? They want to know what has happened in your life. And especially now, right? Everything's about experience, your experience, right? You can testify to your own experience. I think I've mentioned before, a friend of mine we were at lunch, colleagues at lunch, and one person was talking about what a hard time they were really going through. And my other colleague, who's a Christian, said, I can only tell you what helps me. I pray about it. In the end, that's all any of us can do is my experience, right? And that's critical. That is a critical part. Remember, none of the other gospel writers wrote the book of Acts. They stopped with the death and resurrection. For Luke, the experience of the church is essential.
Yes.
So let's look at some of these other passages. Charlene, was there anything else you wanted to bring out about this?
The forgiveness of sin.
Yes. Repentance and forgiveness of sins. Absolutely. Repentance and forgiveness of sins. He really hits it all. In fact, I wrote in the margin of my Bible decades ago, kerygma. He kind of hits it all.
What is that?
That means the message.
I forgot.
Kerygma.
know what that means.
Kerygma, yeah. So let's look at Acts 2:22 through 24.
Mhm. We liking it.
Dictionary definition is the apostolic proclamation of salvation through Jesus Christ. Because I had to look it up again, too.
The Greek just means the message.
Mhm. Like the Bible.
So read what Peter says to us in Acts 2:22 through 24.
Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to a cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him.
Thank you. Notice that pretty much so all there. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Notice, as you yourselves know, so he's tying in their own experience. The definite plan and foreknowledge of God, right? We're not going to go through all of these because time has elapsed, but you can see those elements in all of these passages. And that really should get you well on your way to, if you were hauled up, or if you find yourself in that conversation where the Holy Spirit has given opportunity, be ready, St. Peter says, be ready to give an account. So have a blessed week. Thank you again, Tricia. It was really great.
Yes, thank you.
Really great.
Thank you.
Go in peace to serve the Lord.
Have a good week, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.